Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I do see a lot of parallels with both what Richard Kaufman said and Christina said before. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk about disruption and change and economic opportunity and things of that nature. And thank you to Phil for joining me here in this conversation. We're going to do a little bit of back and forth conversation about the thing to sort of drive to the conversation that Steve just said. So the first thing I would say, and I don't think that there's a whole lot of disagreement here, which is the generation mix in the United States is changing from coal and nuclear and some of the less efficient things towards renewables and that have lower and lower cost, marginal cost of energy, as well as distributed resources that we've been talking about the last couple of days. The location and the ownership is changing of these resources, as well as the cost. Even on an unsubsidized basis, Lazard is reporting that wind and solar at the utility scale are becoming just as cost competitive with natural gas. Now, we can quibble about whether the capacity and the energy and all of that, but generally the trend is towards lower and lower marginal cost energy resources. The older, more costly fleets that were installed in the 50s and the 60s are being retired increasingly, and we're trying to look at sort of what's next. Also, on the other side of the wires, the customers are starting to evolve, and the customers that have gone through telecom deregulation and now have cell phones that have all sorts of computing power, they're starting to expect choice, and they're starting to expect the benefits of technology. And along with that, they want information and they want control of their decisions. Load growth is relatively flat in a lot of parts. The only thing that seems to be growing are data centers, and not just Bitcoin mining, but real data centers. So there is some load growth in pockets, but ultimately that. And two more things before I say that the world is changing a little bit is that, as we've been discussing over the last couple of days, the energy infrastructure is aging. And there has not been significant investment. And I think if you look at what's been going on in Northern California, one of the realizations is that the grid has not been invested in sufficiently to be hardened against risks that I think we talked about 5 risks yesterday, that type of thing. So the final thing I would say, and I think that Ron and Steve and the gang put together a great thing, is digitization is happening. It is happening. It's happening throughout our economy, and it's not something that we should expect is not going to affect the electric utility. So that's, I guess, the starting salvo to get going. What do you think?
Well, I think you make some great points, Todd, because you mentioned that this is a very, very dynamic time, and we're seeing a cleaner, greener grid out there, fleet out there. It's something that customers want. It's a time when costs are falling. The essential nature to all of it, though, whether it's at universal utility scale production of renewables or whether it's at the distribution level, is the key is the grid. And the grid needs investment. And whether we want to go, as I think we do as a society, toward a much cleaner and greener generation fleet, we're still going to need a transmission build out. And that's something that's extraordinarily hard to do. Arguably harder after the FERC decision of a few weeks ago related to investment returns. At the distribution level, as you noted, it was designed, as most of the system was, as a one-way system. We now have 85 million smart meters in the country that allow for both two-way information flow and facilitating two-way energy flow. To me, though, as a former regulator, it often comes down to the rate structures.
Absolutely.
And historically, 100 years ago, we had rate structures that more adequately, frankly, reflected costs, grid costs versus generation costs. As a society over the decades, we kind of slid into this system, as inelegant as it was still convenient to load most of the grid costs onto the commodity side of what a customer pays. You can get away with that with load growth, as sloppy as it is. But as you noted, in many places, demand is flat. That kind of exacerbates flaws in not having adequate cost causation, particularly at distribution level. So that's something that I think we have to address in order to facilitate the innovation that I think most people want and we know is coming.
Right. Actually, let's talk a little bit about regulation,
Yeah.
the next step. And you served on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for a number of years at a time where there was significant change.
Yes.
If we go back, PURPA in 78, Order 888, Order 2000, RTOs, those types of things, I think that a lot of change in the restructuring was responsive to regulation. Where do you see regulation right now? I mean, and that, because I have a particular point of view that I know but, the utility structure we have today reflects the regulation and the policies that have been in place, right?
Right, well said. And I know we'll get into it probably more later, but we have states that are restructured where generation obviously is not owned by the incumbent energy company. We have states where it's vertically integrated, and there's a little bit of mix in some states as well. And it's easy to forget that those were decisions that were made with the support of typically legislatures and the public and the regulators at the time. The results have been mixed. In some places it works well. In some places there have been some challenges to restructured markets as to whether they're actually delivering benefits. So to back it up, at the federal level, we were essentially, the way I kind of describe some of the challenges we have now are that when the market rules were set up roughly 20, 25 years ago, most of the generation fleet was what we consider base load. There were some exceptions to that, a little bit more gas in certain regions. And so what base load brings to the market in terms of a physics, system reliability side of things really didn't have to be compensated separately because most generating units brought it. As we go to a system where there is less base load, that's clearly happening, we do have some challenges about how to make sure the system is maintained. Obviously, we're seeing that more and more in the Southwest with overgen in the afternoons and the need to ramp up to meet load, particularly this time of year around, say, 5 or 6 o'clock when people are coming home. I think at the federal level, the regulatory side of things has to recognize the dynamic changes in the generation fleet so that ultimately we don't overspend on infrastructure, but send the right market signals to people. And then that ties into regulators at the distribution level. I just firmly believe that you can't expect customers to change behavior unless you give them accurate price signals. And that means a pretty tough job of, I think, realigning rates so that grid costs are adequately reflected in a customer's bill, and that then the commodity cost is more reflective of the real-time price of electricity. We got so much potential with data analytics out there now.
Right.
The different aspects of customers. I talked to one CEO of a data analytics firm, and he said, in his ideal world, and he realized it's not possible, there'd be 200 rate classes because that's how different customers are. And again, we need to give them the kind of signals that then they can, their behavior in terms of consumption can reflect the accuracy of the value of power at that time.
We agree completely to this point. We're going to go a little bit deeper now.
I know you want a little drama here.
No, we got a drama. It's in the morning. The caffeine is settled in. So I would say a few things a bit more provocative here. I think that the utilities, and some, not all, and everything I'm going to say about utilities, there is a spectrum of them. I would say that the utilities have a significant amount of resources and expend them to preserve the status quo. Somewhat.
All right.
It's debatable.
Salvo number one.
Salvo number one. I think there's the concept of regulatory capture that has been discussed since the 70s. I think that some state commissions are very cozy, let's just say, with some utilities. And in other places, I don't think it's so much coziness as much as they're out-lawyered, out-gunned, out-resourced. I've done rate cases. I know how good utilities are at doing rate cases. They very often will spend a year or two putting 40 different changes into a rate case, and the rate advocates in the PUC will only figure out that there's only 6 to 8. They'll argue about it, and the commission splits a baby. But the other 36, 34 issues, sorry, with those numbers, were never even figured out. So I think that as we think about competitive markets and regulated utilities, I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the utilities, especially in the vertically integrated states, and I am actually a believer in the natural monopoly of operating the grid. However, you'll see, and we've seen in a lot of the vertically integrated states, you have Pacificor or the Berkshire Hathaway company sending $60 million in the state of Nevada last year to defeat retail access in that state. That is, I think, an indication of the power of the utility to preserve the status quo. So I'm going to just throw it back to you before and pause and see, we told you we mix it up a little bit, huh? All right, so.
Well, I think it's always key to remember that this is really the one industry that has an obligation to serve. You talked about telecom, and I used to work on those issues back in Olympia, back during the time of restructuring. And what's different, of course, is now we have ubiquitous wireless service, and landlines are kind of a thing of the past. So I get to your point that of course, customers want to have more options, more choices. But telecom, and even really water, doesn't have an obligation to serve the way electricity does. So that's a fundamental difference that's easy to forget, but really drives a lot of what's the regulatory structure that emanates from that societal good. I go back to the fact that rate structures are such that are not sending right now, in most places, the most precise investment signals. When I talk to state regulators, I certainly urge them all, if they haven't been to a control center, whether it's CAISO in Folsom, or whether it's MISO in Carmel, or the Southern Company in Birmingham, or New York, wherever, you should go see one because of the visibility of the bulk power system that is now available that even maybe 15, 20 years ago we didn't have. And you can see real-time congestion, where flows are going, what's out of service. Sometimes you see 5-minute pricing zones, incredible visibility. And frankly, that's the kind of investment we need at the distribution level to fully allow for more decentralized power, more devices onto the grid that we haven't even imagined yet, more ability to, using AI, analyze equipment and that could be going out of service eventually, so that again customers are better served. And so I certainly don't see the regulatory capture. It kind of depends on what side of the fence you're on. But if you go to Nevada, I mean, the bottom line was that the clean energy future that Nevada wanted was going to be much better facilitated by the incumbent energy company than to have some kind of a disruption. And so I think that's ultimately what the voters figured out, was that if the plans going forward were such that there would be significant greening and cleaning of the Nevada energy production, but it was going to happen only with the role of the incumbent energy company with those plans, and those would be disrupted if with the chaos of what was proposed on the ballot initiative.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you got there. I thought you were going to go polite on me the whole way and we'd never get to it. So, good. So, let's talk about New York. Let's talk about Texas.
Okay.
Why should customers in Abilene or Ithaca, New York, places I've lived in my life, have more choices than whether it be, putting rooftop solar owned by Sunrun or somebody like that, or other type of, buying community solar in San Francisco, whatever. Why are all of these choices out there things that people enjoy and that people find value in? But yet in our hometown of Spokane, no choice at all. And there's about 30 states in the country that have no choice at all. You take the paternalistic Nevada power type of arrangement where the utility knows best, it and the regulator will decide what you want, and you will be served that and you will pay that. Why is that fair? Why is that good for customers?
Well, if you take ERCOT, for example, I mean, that's a case where there was the political support to develop that model, and the rules of implementation are very key to whether
Absolutely.
it works or not.
Absolutely.
And they're relatively complicated, and obviously you need consumer protections that are adequate and enforced thereof. And so the ERCOT model, again, no capacity market, is a relatively unique one. I think the folks in New York have done some creative things. And again, I believe there's the political support for the road that they've gone down. Obviously, they've backed off a little bit, but they've got some very talented people who guide the decisions there. And yet there are issues there too. The transmission grid in New York is old. I always remember going up to the control system there probably 12 years ago, and it's like, we get these thunderstorms in the Hudson Valley and they knock out lines, and it creates problems, and there were rules about expanding the grid. So, and I think even the governor has recognized that the transmission system there needs major updates given its age and the dynamic nature of where power is produced and consumed in New York. In other places, again, it goes back to whether there's the political support for which model. I think our companies are more and more giving people options if they want to get a green product, if they want to, in many cases, voluntarily go to real-time pricing. Those are the kind of things that we've been focusing on. Maybe we don't tell our story as broadly and as loudly as we should, but it's clear where we're going. Customers want more option. I still go back to the rate structures, though. If they're not designed correctly, those choices will be minimized, and there's a greater chance for cost shift, which we certainly as a society, I think, want to avoid.
Absolutely agree, and we're going to hopefully end our conversation here on how we improve rate structures, then incentivize the type of development of the grid that Gridwise Alliance has been talking about over the last couple of days. But still on generation for a little bit longer here. When it comes to competition, this town is getting a little bit weird. Because in this seat last night, the guy, Rich from, he was the guy that was sitting here in the Republican. He said competition is no good, it's outdated, we don't, he said so. And meanwhile, Melanie, the Democrat, she sat over there and said, oh, markets are fine. We just have to revise them. We have to make them more accurate. So this town's getting a little weird, I have to say. But I always have thought that the discipline imposed by the market and by choices and free choices, this is going back to my education, is more powerful and more dynamic and more stimulative of innovation, like we're all talking about here, than is regulation. And I'm coming from a free trade Democrat standpoint, and there aren't too many of us left. but I mean, when you look at, do you think that regulators and the utilities that are all chasing their fiduciary duty to make money for their shareholders, through vertical integration, and I'm talking about the vertically integrated states, do you think that that is superior and will lead to lower cost generation than more competition on generation and in generation markets?
Well, the policy of this country is basically, our energy policy is essentially competition. And the FERC, certainly when I was there, promoted competitive markets.
Absolutely, and I thank you for that.
Well, but again, there has to be the political support in, the FERC made a decision that before I arrived, that RTOs are voluntary. And that's been sustained. So conceptually, there have been incredible benefits from markets that allow for larger footprints, more efficient dispatch. Even the West has recognized that with EIM. And yet the details really do matter. I would argue that price formation is now still an ongoing matter at the Commission. And we've had real problems with uplift over the years that have bankrupted a number of retail suppliers, all kinds of problems there that that don't provide or that mask some of the more transparent price signals that would have really allowed markets to work better. But it goes down to something that I think we need to wake up to, which is that with the generation mix changing so much, there are some very strange things happening. We are now, frankly, very, very dependent on natural gas to make electricity. Absolutely. In many markets. Markets really weren't thinking that. I mean, when we designed the markets, we collectively, thousands of people, gas was a much smaller part of the generation mix. It's a just-in-time fuel. There are implications to that from a reliability perspective, and they're two very different industries. I took this issue on when I was at the commission to get better coordination. We still have a long way to go, and it's frankly a threat to our national security if we don't get it together better. And there's elements of that. And with price suppression, I think that's where you've seen the call for some types of units, particularly those that are carbon-free, to be rewarded for that aspect of their generation mix. Then we get into carbon pricing and carbon policy, right. and that gets mixed up regionally as well. So generally speaking, the competitive markets have provided customers with incredible benefits, but they are so complex and so detailed, and the system is changing so quickly that there needs to be a recognition of all of that. And ultimately, it's easy to forget that electricity is now the smallest percentage of a household's expenditures than it's ever been since records were started in the 50s. So we do have a pretty good situation in terms of what people get for what they pay.
I would agree that we have, and to Christina's point, we've got a system that works very well. It provides electricity at a low cost and stable. I think we're going to a world where that's changing, and we'll leave generation in a minute, but I would say, and I think this is where we started our conversation some months ago, that we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change. If we are replacing the fleet of generation that's been in effect for the last 50 years. And a fundamental question, I think, for everybody in this room and the country is who is going to own the new generation? Are we going to allow the same utilities that have been in charge for the last 50 years to own the generation for the next 30, 40, 50 years? And this is a time that we need to be thinking about this, because I do think that competition, at the retail level works. And I think that if you look at, and the Retail Electric Suppliers Association put out a report last year that said basically 25% lower prices at the unbundled energy price in competitive states versus vertically integrated states. And we could squabble about that back and forth, and I know, but I think it's worth paying attention. I want to shift slightly to what, you can respond to that if you want, but I actually thought...
I think there were a lot of questions about that study, but
all right.
We'll leave it at that.
We'll leave it at that. We could squabble about that. I actually would like to talk about innovation and the grid that Richard Kaufman was talking about the system integrators, and how do we incentivize the utilities that I will agree that on the distribution and transmission side should be operating a grid in which their job is to make the system work as efficiently as possible, to be smart, reliable, digitalized in a way that the information flows in all sorts of different directions, that allows for the innovation that the people, the disruptors, and all of that. How do we incentivize that? As a former regulator, how do we incentivize? Because to tell you the truth, and you're not on the commission now, I don't see from any state regulator or federal regulator the vision. I think Rev was probably among the leader. I think what they're doing in Hawaii and in California. But I don't see a sort of a unified vision of how we incentivize the regulated utilities that own these wires to actually get to that next thing.
Well, I think it's going to be jurisdiction by jurisdiction.
State by state?
State by state.
So the feds FERC can't, Congress and FERC can't make stuff happen?
Well, they can facilitate, for instance, with the storage order 841, certain development of certain technologies into certain markets, along with our other partners, the electric co-ops and APPA. We felt like FERC should have given states an opt-out on that, similar to what happened with demand response, because some states are less comfortable going that way than others. And similarly, for instance, the concept of aggregating DERs, it's definitely possible and it can be facilitated. But it's going to take a lot of investment, as I said earlier, to get the visibility on the distribution level to allow that to happen. As long as people are understanding what the investment needs are, it can happen. That's going to take some courage from regulators because it's going to cost a lot of money. I think, again, I'll go back to rate structures. If we send the right rate signals, and I would argue that Ontario has done it, it took a lot of courage, that can facilitate all kinds of innovation that, again, helps customers. But if grid costs aren't accurately reflected in rates, you're having cost shifts that create other problems down the road.
Well, I would completely agree with that and that vision. I think that, as was mentioned, one of the most important things to actually having the grid operate in a more open manner where there's flows is actually getting the utility out of participating in that market at the same time to allow, as I think Richard mentioned, in the state of New York, the utilities can't own DERs and they can't own the utility scale generation. That is for other people who are participants, which allows for the wires company to make the markets, control the markets, and make the utility system work better, rather than putting its foot on, and it has been demonstrated that they will always look out for how they make money. So I think it's decoupling, it's a variety of other things, but it's also getting the people that run the grid to actually focus on that and the investment, because I have a feeling that people will invest in the grid when there's economic opportunity, to get the return.
Well, I agree. Again, the obligation to serve is something that is out there all the time for the incumbent energy companies. A lot of it's comfort level. I think in New York, there's comfort with going that model. It wouldn't be that case in other jurisdictions, and ultimately the regulators have to be comfortable with whatever direction they have. But when you get back to generation and who owns it, that's a big topic. Again, it'll play out different regionally, but what we call universal scale, utility scale solar is a third of the cost of rooftop. It's a third. So if we're actually concerned about costs as we go forward with the need for more investment, that has to be part of it. And again, if you're getting what I would say is overcompensated for the power you send back to the grid in certain markets at the distribution level, that's a cost shift. And essentially it's poor people subsidizing rich people, and I have a real problem with that.
Well, I think that people ought to have the when it comes to rate making and cost allocation, I'm completely with you.
Okay.
And I have no squabble with that. I would say this, that customers want choice.
Sure.
And customers, don't like nuclear cost overruns being put onto them because the generator, the vertically integrated generator, decided that it was going to do it, and now $10 billion has to go find some place. That is also a cost overrun that gets put on the customers that the customers did. Now, there might be political will to make that happen, or not in South Carolina, but, there is a question of faith, and that you do have to remember what the customer wants. And if a customer, even in Seattle, wants to put solar on his roof, he should not be putting cost onto others, agreed, but he or she should be able to do that. I think that when it comes to innovation and the types of things that we've been trying to encourage here, it's incumbent in creating a grid that allows for that to happen.
Absolutely.
And when in states where vertically integrated utilities are making sure that third-party ownership and other things like that can't happen, that needs to be addressed as well, because we need to open things up.
I think you're right, and there's a question as to how visible the distribution planning process should be that I think needs to be dealt with, because there are some sensitive issues there in terms of how much you open it up to third parties without some element of security. But if you go back to, let's say, the EV charging issue, our general feeling is that it should be open to all. There's a role for our electric companies, particularly because if you're in private investment, you're probably not going to try and put chargers everywhere. You're going to try and put them at the most lucrative locations. And I think you can look to what California did, where our companies were prohibited from getting into EV charging, and then 3 years later they reversed their decision because they saw it wasn't happening.
Right.
And so there's plenty of room for everybody to play. There's obviously issues of cost shift when there's customers' money being involved with developing EV charging stations, and that has to be a balance that commissions take on. I think we've got some good examples from around the country where they have. And that then goes into social policy in terms of electrifying the transportation fleet. How much of that should be individual and how much of that is kind of a shared cost? And that, again, gets decided jurisdiction by jurisdiction.
Jurisdiction. All right, we're time, right? We're giving us the hook. No more questions? We've had enough questions between the two of us?
We got a senator.
Oh, we got a senator. All right, we had a senator.
Yeah.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Tom.